Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Herbert, who is the Managing Director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies and a lecturer in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. Dr. Herbert has extensive experience conducting research related to housing policy and urban development, both in the U.S. and abroad. His research focuses on the financial, social, and demographic dimensions of home ownership, the dynamics of the rental housing market, the nature and causes of racial and socioeconomic segregation, as well as the implications of a rapidly aging society for housing. Dr. Herbert is co-editor of A Shared Future, Fostering Communities of Inclusion in an Era of Inequality, and Home Ownership Built to Last, Balancing Access, Affordability, and Risk After the Housing Crisis. He currently serves on the board of directors of Freddie Mac and is a member of the advisory board of the Milken Institute Center for the Future of Aging. He holds a PhD and a master's in public policy from Harvard University and a BA in history from Dartmouth College. Today, Dr. Herbert will discuss the state of housing in the U.S., the outlook for 2021, and the need for a national housing policy that is race conscious if we're going to address the impact of racial residential segregation in this country. There will be time for a few questions, so please include them in the Q&A box. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Herbert.
Thank you, Maria. It's terrific to be here with you today. I really enjoyed that last panel, and there'll be a lot of overlap in the kind of things I'll be talking about this afternoon. As you mentioned, I'll be talking about State of the Nation's Housing Report that the Joint Center just put out a little over 2 weeks ago. This is an annual report we've been doing since 1988 that covers a broad swath of the housing market and is really intended as a reference source to provide information to inform policy, advocacy, and industry. And I put up a little commercial here of how to find your way to the report. Over time, we've tried to make it more accessible in terms of using the data, the graphics, and the like that come from the report to help tell the stories in your local area. So I encourage you to check that out, and hopefully you'll find it of value. In the time I have today, I wanted to give you a quick review of a few headlines. As I said, this is a report that covers a broad swath of the housing market, so it's often hard to write a single headline. But I would say there's three big themes in this year's report that I want to highlight for this group today. And the first is about the issue of rental affordability and the fact that the crisis we've been having for a long time, rental affordability, has been very much exacerbated by the pandemic. So one of the things we track is the share of households who are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing, or even severely burdened, spending more than half their income on housing. So this chart is showing you the count of renter households falling into these categories over time. And I think what's remarkable about this, what we have been calling for a while is the rental affordability crisis, is how bad this issue got over the course of the first part of this century and how little it's improved, even over the last decade when we've had one of the strongest economies in a long time. You can see that the number of renters facing these cost burdens went from about 15 million to upwards of 21 million over time. But since 2011, that number has barely budged. And about 10.5 million renters, as of 2019, were still severely cost burdened, spending more than half their income on housing. And this has really become both a pervasive problem, a severe problem, and a persistent problem. And so as we go into the pandemic, we're going into it in a situation where renters are already financially strained, even without the impact of that pandemic. Another key aspect of the rental housing crisis to focus on, though, too, is how it affects people at different parts of the income distribution. So this chart is showing you the share of renter households by different income categories: under $25,000 a year, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and above 75. Now, a couple of things to note from this chart. First of all, as you look across these categories, what you'll see is, in general, those shares of cost burden renters have been going up over time. And really, the areas where the cost burdens have got up the most have been among renters in more moderate income categories. And so we talk about the renter affordability problems moving up the income ladder. And we talk about that a lot because I think it democratizes this problem and tries to bring greater attention, greater political will behind the need to address it. But if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, we should never forget is that this issue of rental affordability is by far worse for people at the lowest income strata. So about 80%, 4 out of 5 renters making less than $25,000 a year, Now, mind you, $25,000 a year includes people working full-time year-round at the minimum wage and above. So these are not necessarily highly impoverished people, although they're in there as well. But among that group, 4 out of 5 are cost burdened. Almost 2/3 are severely burdened. And so as much as this is a problem that has been moving up the income ladder, we should never forget that it's heavily concentrated and most severe by far among the poorest households. And I think for this group in particular, what we'd like to highlight, or what's important to highlight, is the intersection between housing affordability and other challenges that low-income households face. So this chart is showing you how much money on a monthly basis households who are in the bottom expenditure quartile, so the bottom quartile of the distribution of households by resources, how much they spend on food and healthcare. On the left-hand side of the chart are households with children. On the right-hand side are older adults above 65. And you can see that there is a meaningful relationship between those who are unburdened, have housing that's within their budget, less than 30% of their income, and those who are severely burdened. They're spending about $200 less a month on food if you're severely burdened. And your modest amount of spending on healthcare essentially falls to zero among those households with children. And you can see a similar pattern among older adults. And so when we talk about the failure of our system to provide adequate rental support, we're also talking about the failure of our system to put people in a situation where they have adequate food, where they have adequate health care. And we can also see that this also relates to your ability to afford transportation and therefore access to jobs. So all the things that this group cares about, how this intersectionality between housing, food, healthcare, and jobs are really very much tied into the housing affordability crisis we've been going through. And as I said at the outset, this issue of housing affordability, which existed as we went into the pandemic, has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and particularly for low-income households of color. So this chart is now showing you data from the Census Bureau Pulse Survey, which has been done on every other week basis over the last few months, actually started in April. And it shows you what share of renter households are reporting that they're behind on their rent. And the data I'm showing you here is from late September, so these are people well into the month of September. And overall, 15% of renters report being behind on their rent. But if you look here on the left-hand side of the chart, people under $25,000 a year, it's more like 1 in 5. And if you're talking about people of color, black and brown people, it's 1 in 4 renters who are behind on their rent. Again, this goes back to what we were talking about in the last panel. I believe it was Nancy, who was talking about the lack of assets as well among poor people and poor renters in particular. If you're already facing significant shares of your income for rent, you don't have the ability to save. And then when the pandemic comes in, you're more likely to have lost your job. Those problems are all exacerbated to a higher degree. And we should never forget, again, it's worse for poor people and worse for people of color. And so one of the things in the report we talked about is that really the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated the failures of policies to address this affordability issue. And we are hoping that it's creating a conversation about the need to expand and create a more permanent safety net for renters. So that was one big headline about the issue of rental affordability. The second really is reflects again where we have been as a nation this year and wrestling with the legacy of centuries of racial oppression, and particularly for African Americans. And so one of the things we highlighted in the report is the fact that racial disparities in housing are both a cause and a consequence of other social inequalities. And here, just to illustrate that point, what we're showing is the share of population who are below poverty, so those are the orange bars, and above poverty, the blue bars, who live in neighborhoods that have high poverty, poverty rates above 20%. And this is just a striking statistic for those who are familiar with it, which is if you look at the proportion of black and brown people who live in areas of high poverty, among the poor blacks, 70%, more than 2/3 live in these high poverty neighborhoods, which is twice the share of poor whites who live in that neighborhood. And that's also true of Native Americans, it's true of Hispanics, and to a lesser degree also true among Asians. And then if you look at the people who are not poor, people who are above poverty level, about 40% of black and brown people live in these poor neighborhoods compared to only 10% of white households. And so when we say that racial disparities in housing are a cause and a consequence of other inequalities, they're a consequence in that the issues that Maurice was talking about, the wage gap, the opportunity gap, the wealth gap, all these things affect people's ability to access housing and access higher opportunity neighborhoods, lower poverty neighborhoods. And they're also a cause because of the fact when people are consigned, as it were, to very poor neighborhoods. They have less access to good schools, less access to jobs, poorer health environments, and the like, all of which feed into their ability to have a job, to advance, and to be able to do well. And so, as a Center for Housing Studies, it's not surprising that you find that we really think that housing, in many respects, is a linchpin of access to opportunity, and the racial disparities in housing are significant. And really, we think about policies designed to address those racial inequalities. Housing policies need to be front and center in that conversation. Just one aspect of those inequalities, certainly we can look at differences in rental cost burdens, much higher for people of color. Incidents of homelessness, 3 times as high for Blacks and Native Americans. But I think one of the most striking examples is the magnitude of homeownership gaps. And Nancy and Maurice were both talked about, and Mark's work as well, talks about the ability to access homeownership as a source of wealth accumulation, as a source of stability in your housing costs. And if you look at the difference between whites and African Americans, 31 percentage point difference in homeownership rate, 27 percentage points for Hispanics, 16 points for Asians. These are enormous differences in homeownership that do not have any corresponding relationship to people's desire to own a home. And if we look at the right-hand side, it shows how rates have been going up across the board, but basically Blacks have been falling further behind, gaining less than whites. Hispanics are just keeping pace, and Asians are doing better, but not enough to close that gap in any meaningful way. And so in the report, we then talk about the need for a new national housing policy to address these significant issues we see. We have not as a country put together a comprehensive, systematic approach to providing housing opportunity in this country. And we like to harken back to the 1949 Housing Act, which called for a decent home and a suitable living environment for all. We've added to that the goal of having it be affordable as well. And so what we call for in the report is, first of all, for the government to set clear goals for housing supports. Who is it that we believe is we want to provide rental housing assistance to, opportunities to buy a home, and then fully fund those programs, not just to have 1 in 4 people who are eligible get that assistance. Secondly, we need to address regulatory barriers that constrain the ability of the private market to supply lower-cost housing in a range of communities. We have to expand opportunities through the private sector as well. And also, we believe we need to have programs and policies that are race conscious to address these sharp racial disparities. We can't just ignore the fact that there's a 31 percentage point gap in Black-white homeownership rates, that the homeless rate is 3 times what it is. We have to have policies that really take into account these enormous disparities. We argue this policy needs to promote broader access by people of color and lower income households to existing thriving communities. But at the same time, I think there's going to be too much emphasis on this mobility, this moving to opportunity concept. When as that chart I showed you shows significant shares of people of color live in impoverished communities. And Maurice's 10X challenge talks about investing in these communities, to invest in healthcare, to invest in transportation, to invest in access to jobs, and to invest in good quality housing, all of which are important to turn those communities around, to make them thriving communities. So our call for housing policy is to not only advance mobility, but to advance investment in communities, which will call for more cross-sectoral coordination. So let me stop there and take any questions that you have. But I think that this group that Annie has assembled is working at the intersectionality of these issues is so important. So it's really great for me to be able to take time to connect with you.
Thank you, Chris. We do have a question here. Working households were fragile before the pandemic, and current eviction and foreclosure moratoria has slowed the immediate rate of housing insecurity. But with these safety mechanisms set to expire at the end of this year, how can communities begin to prepare now to support this expanded population of cost-burdened households?
Well, I guess I would hope and pray that the proposal that's making its way through Congress now finally does come to fruition, because I think the magnitude of this issue that will become evident in January will probably be beyond the capabilities of local governments, local areas on their own to deal with. Now, as you all probably know, the unemployment benefits for about 12 million workers will expire on December 26th. The CDC moratorium on evictions will expire on December 31st. You put those two things together, and there's going to be millions of renters and homeowners who are facing the ability to make their housing payments come January 1st. I think that localities have been doing a fair amount in the last 6 and 7 months of this pandemic to try to put together emergency relief programs. And so hopefully there's lessons that have been learned from that. But I think what's really going to be needed is an infusion of federal support to be able to put some resources in the hands of those local authorities to be able to make up that difference.
Great, thank you. So we heard earlier about the baby bonds. I believe it was Nancy who was talking about Cory Booker. So Assets in the Poor, written by Michael Sheridan in 1991, illustrates viable asset building policies that are ripe for enactment, similar to the baby bonds. Do any of the asset building experts that you're aware of, are there federal or state level policy ideas that we could hear about here?
Sure. I think baby bonds is certainly an important piece to get people to start early in life. We've been talking a lot about home ownership, and I certainly am a big advocate for enabling people to get into home ownership as a way to build wealth and to control their housing costs. And I think that if you look at the share of wealth held by low-income households and households of color, housing is a really important pillar of that. So I think housing has to be access to homeownership an important part of it. Beyond that, I think what we need to do is expand both the availability and how we use tax resources to encourage savings. Michael Sheridan was a big proponent of individual development accounts, savings accounts that were matched. Now, we have a program like that right now for the wealthy, which is your IRA contributions are not subject to taxation. And if you're making, in the 30% tax bracket, you're basically getting 30 cents matched for every dollar you put aside. We need to think about taking those tax dollars and rather than directing them to higher income households, is to up the match and make it more available for lower income households. So I think thinking about a variety of mechanisms for encouraging and matching savings, and thinking about how do we do that outside of an employer-based system that we have now, which doesn't reach as many people as it needs to. How do we create systems that are available for people, whatever their work is, if they're in gig economies, if there are other jobs, and make those accounts stay with them over time so they can build wealth. So, I think it's home ownership. I think it's creating incentives and structures for savings, and things like baby bonds would all go a long way towards helping close that asset gap.
Thank you. And Dr. Herbert, I think we have time for one more question. Could you comment on the potential role quality that manufactured housing can play in the affordable housing supply, especially in rural areas?
Sure, absolutely. We had an incredible increase in home ownership among low-income households in the 1990s. I know all of us have painful memories of what happened in the early 2000s. But if you look at actually when most of the gains were made in home ownership, most of those occurred in the 1990s and before the Wild West days of subprime lending and all-day lending in the early 2000s. And much of that, the Joint Center's own analysis at the time found, was through access to manufactured housing. And certainly the quality of these homes has gotten much better. And as many of the people in this room may know, there is a question about access to affordable and good terms lending. There's issues around titling of manufactured housing. If they're not titled as real estate, they turn to be personal property loans that are at higher interest rates. And so finding ways to improve the access to good financing for those homes will be an important way of providing the kind of fuel needed to help expand that. But manufactured housing is certainly a cheaper source of homes in terms of the cost savings that are done, the fact that they're smaller homes. And I think we need to, and the quality of those homes is much better than they were 30 years ago. And so I think it should be an important part of the supply response, certainly in rural areas, but even in suburban areas. And another issue that has to be looked at is regulatory barriers in terms of zoning that might restrict the siting of manufactured housing as infill in a variety of communities. Again, given the improvements in the quality of these homes, I think those are really holdovers from an older era of this housing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate your comments, in particular, the call for a comprehensive national housing policy. I couldn't agree with you more. So really appreciate your participating with us in your discussion this afternoon. Thank you so much.